And, having said all of that, I really would like to welcome today's special guest. And today's special guest is Aliya Bean, who we are very, very fortunate to have. I know Aliya from a network of graduates from Harris School of Public Policy. And Aliya has been very active for a long time in LGBTQ policymaking. She does quantitative work, she does qualitative work, and she worked as the executive director for the LGBTQ Equality Caucus in the US House of Representatives, with a lot of policy work there. And now she works at Manat Health Consulting based in Chicago, but most of her work, I think, is not in Chicago. So it is, I don't know, she'll tell you. I'm going to turn over to Aliya, and she's going to talk to us for a little while, and then we're just going to open it up for live Q&A. But if you have questions that come to your mind, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we will get to them in a little bit. So thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. Let me just get, the good old screen sharing ready to go so you can all see my fun slides. 1 second. Can everyone see those? Get a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So like Heather said, my background is primarily coming from the policy side of things. I currently do health policy work, but previously done LGBTQ plus policy work, and that is still very much an interest of mine. And coming from Chicago, a bit of a data nerd myself, so I'm really excited to talk about LGBTQ data equity and the importance of collecting sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristic data. So I really want to dive in by first setting kind of the current landscape for LGBTQ folks. And I think there are a few kind of key things to know. One is that as of right now, particularly in the United States, which is kind of where I'm going to focus my presentation on, is that there's really a lack of persistent data collection when it comes to this population. And this is a problem because a lot of LGBTQ folks have unique needs and they face disproportionate rates of discrimination and harassment. And the fact is, so many factors make it more challenging for this population to get access to the care and these services that they need. And so we really need data to help inform how to best serve this population. And I think, to kind of get at the state of LGBTQ folks, I think some key facts that I think it's important for folks to know is that a high percentage of LGBTQ folks are low income and living below the poverty level. Transgender youth are disproportionately homeless, even though LGBTQ youth also face homelessness at higher amounts. In fact, it's actually 40% of homeless youth are actually identified as LGBTQ. They're more likely to rely on federal programs like Medicaid and Title X. And so that's what we do know. And so we really need data collection to help inform how to best serve this community. And so I think I want to talk about, so why is sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristic data needed? Not only to kind of advance existing research studies and population trends, but to identify those needs and provide that high quality services. But also because this population experiences so much discrimination, we need to find ways to track and address that. And also distribute funding in a way and resources in a way where people can actually access them. And for me, as a policy person, we really need data to help inform the policies that we want to pass. And then actually the National Academies of Medicine have done some recent work. I have sources at the end of this presentation, highly recommend checking them out, where they looked at kind of SOGISC data. And they found a few key things about that I think is really important to mention, which is that people think that SOGISC data is hard to collect, but in fact, people are really willing to provide that information. And it doesn't actually require as much effort as some people think, and we'll kind of go into kind of best practices. And people are really willing to answer these questions if you're willing to ask them. But the issue is that right now, not enough people are asking these questions. There's really a persistent lack of routine data collection. Most studies right now in the government and state governments do not collect this information. In fact, the Center for American Progress found that 5 in 6 LGBT adults, so that doesn't include folks that identify as queer or other labels or intersex, found that they can't be identified in existing questions in surveys. So this is a really, really big issue. And in fact, as of 2016, there are only 12 studies total, 11 federal surveys and 1 federal study that collect data on sexual orientation. Only 6 of those actually collect data on gender identity. And 10 of those are through the Department of Health and Human Services. And you can see below a variety of services. One that I'm particularly used to, kind of delving into is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System data. Given my previous work focused on LGBTQ youth, and having that information is so important to figure out what do LGBTQ youth need and how can we best serve them. So the other 2 studies are actually collected by the Department of Justice. So it's very limited. And as a result, we really rely on a lot of more kind of community-based surveys. And these have been primarily the way that we are collecting the data on LGBTQ folks. And so a lot of kind of existing state and federal policies actually use these surveys and these studies to inform their policy and policy making. So this is a variety of these surveys that are really important. If you're interested, I would really recommend checking them out. One of my favorite surveys is the National Center for Trans Equality, their transgender survey. It's one of the kind of only national trans surveys that we have. And it has some really, really, really important data. And so kind of despite the fact that these surveys within the LGBTQ community have acted as a valuable resource, particularly in this absence of data from kind of the state and federal side, there's kind of a lack of uniformity on how these questions are asked. And standardization would really help in collecting this data. And so having best practices on how to collect this data is really, really important. And so kind of key considerations as, you as researchers, as academics, as other policy folks, there are a few kind of key things that you really need to weigh as you're collecting data for this population because of the high needs, because of the vulnerability to discrimination. And these are a few considerations here. I think the first is really kind of a defined goal and precise terminology. That's really important to kind of get at the actual questions and the identities you want to collect. A very important part, given the discrimination and continued laws, or continued and kind of ballooning of laws against specifically trans folks and LGBTQ folks more broadly, is strong privacy, confidentiality, and ethical standards. You want to make sure that folks answering these questions voluntarily feel safe, and this information won't get out to the wrong people. Another aspect is adopting and having clear non-discrimination and voluntary participation policies, like I mentioned. And then also, because there are so many great community-based resources, as researchers, as academics, as data collectors, it's important to leverage those. Talk with community leaders, talk with folks that have these connections in the LGBTQ community, and leverage their expertise and figure out how to best ask these questions and make sure that LGBTQ people are meaningfully involved in the question development, testing, and evaluation processes. So now that we've kind of talked about the principles, I really want to talk about what are some ways you can ask these questions in a way that you'll get the answers you desire. And so this is an example of kind of a good way to ask a question about sexual orientation. And so I think I want to note a few key things. First is that this measures sexual orientation only. It doesn't conflate sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that's really important because these are two very separate things. Another one is you have kind of a long list of labels that folks can choose, that meets their needs. Another one is that it allows for culturally specific identification, specifically for American Indian and Alaskan Native populations, because different populations may use different words, and so it's important to be as inclusive as possible. I think some,
One second, we are just working to reconnect with Aliya. They're having a storm where she is. So hopefully she will be back momentarily. One second while we work on what we can do. There we go.
I think my Wi-Fi went out momentarily. I don't know.
It did. Yeah. You were just getting started on the way to ask the question.
Oh my God. Okay. So I really went out for a while. Okay.
No worries. Welcome back.
I know it's bad weather in Chicago, so the Wi-Fi is not doing its best right now. So did I get into any considerations at all? Or
yes, actually, okay. Yes. You're not sharing your screen yet, though. We need you to share screen. Okay. And yes, you had gotten into the considerations for sure.
Okay, let me.
And don't worry about it. It's actually not amazing. It is amazing that this ever works. So no worry. And thank you very much for your kind words in the chat. You are welcome. You may have lost Aliya again. This might turn into an Ask Me Anything. Because we definitely lost Aliya again. But as she mentioned, she's in Chicago and there's a big storm in Chicago. Yes, I know. Her presentation is fantastic. And if we don't manage today, we will definitely do a repeat. We're going to try one more time and see if we can get Aliya back. Yes.
Okay, now I'm back. I'm so sorry, everyone. I hate Wi-Fi issues. It's probably because there's a full moon, always creating issues. Okay.
Yes, we actually heard, Aliya, now that I see the slide, we heard all the way through allows for culturally specific identification for Indigenous.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are kind of the pros to this approach. I think some of the challenges are that because of the write-in field, it will require, to be coded to other folks, responses. And then also just taking into account that you may have to add more terms as they become more prevalent in culture. So like pansexual, for example. And so I think, the Center for American Progress, National Academies of Medicine, other LGBTQ focused organizations, I really found that this is kind of the best way to ask the sexual orientation question. but there's flexibility in, adding a question on asexuality as a standalone to be kind of more comprehensive, adding in additional terms. So I think there's a bit of flexibility, but this is kind of the best practice. So then when it comes to gender identity, usually the best way to ask it is in a two-step question. One, what is your current gender? And the second, what is your sex assigned at birth? And this, once again, kind of the pros of this approach are that it clearly distinguishes the sex assigned at birth from their current gender, really allowing to get at the broad range of how folks may be able to identify themselves when it comes to their gender identity. You also have that long list of options and the write-in and the culturally specific identification. But the challenges with this approach, and specifically with kind of this ballooning of anti-trans laws and folks kind of feeling more nervous about identifying their, gender identity, is that this can be a very sensitive information to disclose. So it's really important to assure confidentiality when you're asking this kind of question, especially kind of in this political moment. Another thing to note is that some states have actually begun to allow non-binary options on people's birth certificates. So you may actually have kind of more flexibility on the sex assigned at birth than we have in the past. Another kind of opportunity here is that it's I think important to discuss and ask about intersex identity, but what kind of best practices have shown is that this should really be a standalone question. It shouldn't really be included in this gender identity question. And so I think some overall best practices when you're asking questions about sexual orientation and gender identity is kind of be as broad and far-reaching as possible. Kind of use questions that clearly specify which components you're trying to measure so that you're not conflating or using other kind of terms as proxy for one another. And also the fact that language can change. So, some surveys may not have non-binary on them. I think it's important to add that given the fact that more and more people are using that term to describe themselves. And it's important to use kind of othering language. So I think, I use a different term is a better way than saying something else or other. And I think having an opt-out component is also really important because some people may not want to disclose this information. So given that we've kind of talked about best practices, because I am a policy person, I always have to come back, what are the policy recommendations? And I think the big ones that I think are important are first for the Congress and the President to sign the LGBTQ Data Inclusion Act. And this was first introduced in the House a few years back. It actually just passed the House last month, has been introduced in the Senate, but no movement there yet. And this bill would essentially require federal agencies that use any sort of surveys to collect information on SOGISC. So that's super important, a really good kind of just foundational data collection mechanism that's really, if it passed, a great way to kind of get that going. The other thing is adding gender identity and intersex measures to the existing surveys collected by the Department of Health and Human Services. A lot of their surveys only collect data on sexual orientation at the moment. And so adding gender identity and intersex is super important and very feasible. The last thing is the Department of Commerce currently doesn't collect any LGBTQ data. And that includes kind of the labor force survey, the American Community Survey, income and program participation. These are really key surveys in the United States. And so adding measures that collect SOGISC information is really important and critical. And I just wanted to spotlight the fact that just really this year, last year, sorry, in last July, the census updated its data collection efforts to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is the first time the census has done that. In the past, it's only collected data on same-sex couples, which leaves out a lot of folks. And so this is a really important step forward. And so I just kind of want to leave you all with this quote from this recent report from the Center for American Progress on data collection for LGBTQ folks. Highly recommend checking it out. That while it's important to weigh all these considerations to capture data for LGBTQ people, doing it and having these measures is so critical, because it will bring visibility, it will generate the evidence-based policies we need, and it will help us meet the needs of this population. And so I really just want to leave you all with that, and just let everyone know that there's a lot of great resources out there. I'm happy to send these to Heather, and she can send them around for folks just so they can take a peek if you want to nerd out. And so that's kind of, sorry for the Wi-Fi issues, but that is kind of where I just wanted to discuss with you all, and now happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Aliya. I really, really appreciate it. While you were having your Wi-Fi issues, there was lots of comments in the chat about how valuable your presentation was, even if we only got that little bit. But the fact that we got it all makes us very, very happy. And there's lots of questions in the chat, so I think that we will just hop right into those. And a couple of them, actually a lot of the ones that started coming in first were about a specific wording. And I know there are lots and lots of pros and cons to whatever wording we're going to use. And that's why I really like that you ended on, don't try and do this perfect, try and do it well and do it.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that a couple of people asked is on the slide where you showed the gender choices, the words that you used were male and female. In this person's understanding, those are sex identities, and that in a gender identity question, would we use women and men? So just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or kind of, and in general, the issue of lots of different people having really different opinions about words.
Yeah, and I think that this is an opportunity where bringing in community folks is the best way, because then you can get folks, opinions and lived experiences in informing these questions. And I would say, so I put female and male up there just because that is what the National Academies of Medicine and other folks have kind of listed as recommended ways. I think you could do woman and man as well, but I think being consistent across as much as possible. And the thing is, language is always changing. You're not going to be perfect. I think that's the important thing. And so the best way to be as accurate as possible and respectful as possible is to bring in those lived experience voices as you're kind of developing these surveys, reading at what best practices are. And so I know that may not be the most satisfying answer, but I really think that the best approach is to ask folks and like I said, ask the question rather than not ask it at all because of fear of maybe like getting the language wrong.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that answer. Really helpful. I'll just, before I go to the next question, I'll mention that if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question live, you're certainly welcome to do that. We'd love to hear you directly ask your question or just have a conversation. The way to do that is to raise your hand in Zoom world. If you can't figure out how to do that, just put it into the chat and we'll help you get unmuted. The follow-up question to including people in your, well, there's a two-part follow-up question about including people in the framing of your questions. The first is, in our experience, just going to try and read this person's words, when we form advisory groups, we end up with people who are privileged and older. Do you know of organizations or policymakers having success finding ways to form advisory groups of people who are marginalized and younger?
Yeah, so I think where I would go first is to go to some of these organizations that have been doing these community-based surveys. For example, like the National Center for Transgender Equality, or the folks that run TransPop or GLSEN for the National School Climate Survey, the Trevor Project. These organizations that do kind of more, first of all, do this survey work, but also do maybe direct services work, and they will have connections to a lot of folks with lived experiences that may be broader than if you just put out a call
right
for folks. And so I think leveraging kind of the existing organizations that are doing the work is a great way to tap into a more diverse panel of folks. Because, you know, if you just put out a call, you probably will get, you know, typically more privileged folks and older folks. Right. But if you can kind of tap into these organizations that are doing more kind of direct service work, they have a network that's a great way to tap into those, to younger folks. And especially now, there's a lot of kind of more youth-led organizations and things like that. And so getting that kind of, because language is changing so much, it's so important to get those kind of younger voices and get like a broad generational panel of folks. So that would be my recommendation. And there's so many wonderful organizations out there that are
that's such a good suggestion, which ties into, it's a follow-up question, because we work with a lot of people that do exactly that, you know, rather than just adopting, you know, some external organization's list of best practices, spend time in the community with people whose data is going to be collected and getting a list. However, what happens then is that we end up with categories that aren't standardized. I know that you think about this a lot because of your work. And I want to say right off the bat, nobody in the world has a perfect answer. So everyone is hoping she's going to solve this for us. But how do you balance getting categories that really represent, say, a very specific community in a specific context, in a specific geography, with like the National Academies of, you know, if that's appropriate in your country or wherever you are?
Oh, that is the question.
It is.
I think, you know, there's usually, the thing is that I actually find that collecting data on sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics is fairly new. So there's a lot of room for kind of innovation. And the truth is there isn't much standardization, which has its pros and cons. It allows for this innovation, but it also creates this issue where, you know, everyone's asking the question in a different way. I think, you know, I tried to show you kind of what the broad range of best practices are in terms of like the best way to ask that question. I think honestly, that is like the best ways to ask that. And then, you know, after you conduct a survey, for example, ask people how they felt about it, and kind of gauge the community response. And, you know, if there's, and this could be included on your survey, you know, like, do you feel like these questions represented you, or some sort of question like that? Like creating opportunities for feedback, I think is really important from participants, because people might say, hey, I really identify as pansexual and this wasn't on here. And if you get that from a lot of folks, maybe you're like, oh, I have to add that. And so really, I think it's a bit of trial and error and just knowing that this may evolve over time, and eventually, hopefully you get to a more standardized way of doing things, but knowing that it may take a bit to get there, and having a process for continued feedback is really important.
Yeah, I would so strongly agree that having that feedback mechanism is really important. And as well, one of the things that we've found, and you can tell me if this, of course, seems like a bad idea to you, is that in that process of doing community consultations with the people who are going to have their data collected, and making sure that they're actually decision making conversations, not just like, you know, please spend a few hours giving us your opinion so that we can kind of ignore it, is having conversations about the trade-offs. You know, let's start with the list of the very nuanced way that we would like to collect this data. And now let's look at what's going to happen when we try and analyze this data and we can't compare it to the city or the province or the country. And like, instead of just thinking that we can't have these conversations with people who aren't, you know, formally educated in these areas, like the pros and cons are as much the pros and cons for people whose data are being collected as they are for us as researchers. Which leads me to my very next question that somebody put in the chat, which is, what do we do during the analysis? Do you have recommendations when we want to collapse these categories? For example, instead of analyzing gay, lesbian, and bisexual as different categories, we want to list one LGBT plus category for sexual orientation to see if disparities exist. Is this appropriate?
So I think this is where it gets tricky. I would say, I think it's important to acknowledge each label as their own, because I think there are some people who would, interchangeably use, lesbian, gay, for example, but some people think of them very different. And so I think if you are going to collapse them, it's also important to do analyses where you're not collapsing those and then analyzing them as separate. And so I would personally tend to like avoid, unless you're doing it as, this is everyone who has identified as straight, and this is everyone else who identifies something other than that. I think like that feels better to me than taking some pieces of the identity and mishmashing them than others. But I think there's no harm in playing around with the data. But I do think if you're going to collapse, it's important to also look at them as distinct identities, because so many people do feel that way. However, a lot of people do use them interchangeably, and that's where it gets tricky. And so, I don't really have like, you should do this, but I think that these are just all things you should be aware of as you're analyzing the data, and taking into all these considerations into account.
Yeah. And one of the things that we try and do is to include a sentence in the data collection about what we're going to do. So if we're going to collapse, we allow people who are providing us with their data to know how we're going to collapse. Mm-hmm. Like, we consider that part of informed consent, that collapsing data categories without a priori knowledge, that's a bad word, but without the people whose data it is knowing that, that we consider that not informed consent. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that we would say is trying to do that. I'm sure there's so many questions here, Aliya. If you have one of them, going by in the chat, but one of them I'm going to ask because we haven't touched on it yet. Curious if data systems are primed to store this data. Are there existing fields where this data would live, or any system, or would systems need to be updated for any added measures? This is a great question. It's really important. Actually part of the formation of our organization, We All Count, because one of my children is transgender and transitioned decades ago, way before anybody was really collecting data like this, and before anybody could store it. So even the people that collected data on my child, when it got to, say, because I'm in Ontario, when it got to our healthcare system, they just couldn't store it. They just kept mistaking the gender of my child. So what's the state of data infrastructure around this?
So I wouldn't say great, to be honest. Given the fact that, so many state and federal agencies aren't even collecting this data in the first place, the fact they don't have methods to store it. I would say one place where they have been better and probably have slightly better storage mechanisms and way to deal with this is the Department of Health and Human Services, because they've kind of been at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, because they've kind of been at the forefront of collecting data on SOGISC. For example, in 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services added a requirement that like electronic health records, have to record sexual orientation and gender identity. So they have that mechanisms in their electronic health record systems. That's very new though, 2016 isn't that long ago. So I still think people are trying to figure out how to best store this, and let alone, they're still trying to figure out how to best to collect it. But I would say, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, these have been kind of two federal agencies that have started to do this. But it really varies on states, like California and, Massachusetts, other states like that are very good about collecting this kind of data. Others haven't even begun or are unwilling to. So I think it really ranges. I wish I had, a clear answer on this is the best data system, but I think it's still such in the beginning stages because they're even just trying to figure out how to best ask the question.
Yeah. And I would say even I know very little about the way that the federal government in the United States collects it, but one of the things that we work with a lot of proprietary data collection, and I would say one of the starting things that you could do about your data infrastructure is redesign it, or just remember that you might have to ask this question more than once. The old-fashioned way is you ask a gender question once and then you have that information about that person forever. If you're doing longitudinal data collection, you don't have to ask that again, but you actually do now. And just making it a field that can be updated can go a long way.
Yeah, I think that's also the key, is just not being afraid to ask the question more than once, because I think the more you ask it, the more people will be accustomed to answering it. And I think, people also, I think LGBTQ people appreciate when they see questions that reflect themselves in surveys. And so I think that's really important too. And so I think the more you ask it, the more answers you're going to get and the more information you're going to get, and the better you'll be at being able to store this information in helpful ways.
Yeah. And not throwing it out as a data error if it changes. Reminding your IT people that when somebody's gender changes, that doesn't mean that it's data trash and needs to be cleaned. It means, you need to know, oh, good, somebody's saying, at least in United States higher education, systems have just been updated to include fields where this data would live in the last few years. That is fantastic. Do you know if that's true? I mean, and again, I don't mean to put you on the spot in the chat, but is that true for iPads? Is that what you mean by higher education? iPads for people who don't work in higher education in the United States is like a federally mandated data system, not iPads yet. Okay, great. There's still room to move there, but that is fantastic that individual institutions are starting to collect this data. That is really, really good news. Okay, some vocabulary questions, which is two, which are really, really good, and thank you for asking them. What's the difference between a gender identity and a sex characteristic?
Yeah, so I think someone posted this in the chat, which I love, the genderbread diagram. I love that. That's a great one. But the way I like to think about gender in general is, so your sex assigned at birth is what is on your birth certificate. It's what the doctor says, when you're first born. Your gender identity is how you feel about your gender. And that could align with what the doctor said when you were born, which would mean you are cisgender. Or it could not align, which means you're transgender, or maybe you identify as non-binary. Sex characteristics, on the other hand, this is kind of a newer term that's been added. I think in the past we've just said SOGI data, but now we're kind of saying SOGISC, and that's really to account for intersex folks. And so kind of intersex is a different identity, which has to do really with, people identify intersex in different ways, but it may have to do with like genitalia when you were born and things like that, and chromosomal situations. And so that's like a broader kind of identity that is kind of becoming more and more common, that people really want to recognize as legitimate. And that kind of could kind of play into this gender identity, and also be seen as something separate. So
Right.
It's very complicated. There's a lot of different ways that people identify. But I think that genderbread diagram that someone posted in the chat is such a great starting place.
Awesome. That is very, very cool. And being identified as by a physician as intersex at birth is not nearly as rare as generally considered. That it is a much more common phenomenon at birth than most of us realize. And the reason most of us don't realize it is we don't collect data on it. And so it creates inaccuracies. Again, like all things data equity, this is a human issue and this is a math issue when we don't know about something. The next vocabulary issue is, why is the T in LGBTQ if T is different than LG and B? Again, I know these are like giant questions that we're not putting on the spot. You can always be like,
well, so this is like a very like historical like movement question. But I think like the reason that kind of LGBTQ has been kind of lumped together is because like another term that people use is like gender and sexual minorities, which I don't always love using the term minority, because I think there's a lot, who knows how many, at this point, who knows how many people identify this way? It may not necessarily, you know, but I think that, so it's kind of lumping into folks that aren't necessarily, who don't identify as straight or cisgender. And so kind of outside of that, that is why. And it's also partially because of advocacy reasons, because this group has been advocating for, there's complexity here, but to get rights for everyone. At the same time, there's a lot of kind of, there can be like tension and conflict between these various identities within kind of this general LGBTQ umbrella. But I think for the most part, politically and like policy wise, we tend to just say LGBTQ plus more broadly for kind of these advocacy purposes, and to kind of distinguish from these folks are not necessarily straight or cisgender. But it is complex. That is it's a big question. I think more and more people are using the term queer, which and they may say like queer and transgender folks instead of LGBTQ, because that encompasses folks that identify in kind of any way. And transgender itself has many identities. So transgender is the umbrella itself. So I think these terms are constantly changing. I think the best way is to ask people how they identify and to just take that as what they say, and trying to, and in terms of data collection, we do tend to group them together. But like I showed earlier, it's very important to ask these questions separately, even though we may lump them together as a label.
Yeah, I thank you for for answering that. It is very, I mean, there are books, many books about this. And so we will, as I said in the chat, we put the recordings, and we also put all of the resources, or as many of the resources as we can that we discuss, up in our forum. And so I just put the link to the forum in the chat, and maybe we'll point you to some good books, because it is complicated and there's never a single answer. And it's a really important question that we get a lot, especially when somebody is encountering a sexual orientation question maybe for the first time, because of whatever, various ways that people find themselves getting asked. In Toronto, where there's a lot of newcomers and immigration, it can be tricky to find a way to answer that, which leads me into what is probably our last question, out of respect for time only, not out of respect for interest, which is that accountability in the federal government in the United States, but this certainly applies to Canada too. The question frames it to the United States, but speaking as a Canadian, we have had our own fair share of issues. I'm worried about starting to collect this data when the Dreamers data was collected. There was no accountability when that privacy was breached. For people who aren't familiar with Dreamers, I'm not an expert on this topic at all, but it has to do with collecting immigration data for people in the United States. And then when the federal administration changed, I think, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think there was, according to this question, some privacy breaches, which seems right based on what I saw in the news. But again, I'm not an expert on what happened there specifically. But the question is, are you aware of any actual accountability mechanisms at the federal level for this data?
Well,
happy Friday, Aliya.
So, I think the thing is this, the Department of Health and Human Services has been collecting this data for a fair amount of time. And to my knowledge, there haven't been, any large data breaches in terms of privacy. So there are ways to do this. There are also community-based organizations that are collecting this data, and people feel comfortable giving that information. However, I think given the current political environment, especially with all of these anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ laws more broadly happening, there is hesitancy among folks to answer these questions. There really is. And so I think, it's really hard because I think there are some states and agencies that are doing this well, and people may feel more comfortable. But I think there is a bit of general distrust. And so collecting data right now might be harder than it has been. And so I think this is where I go back to go to community folks that have trust, and find ways to assure people that their information will be confidential. Because I think that there's kind of these two sides where people want to offer this information so they can get the services and access to the things they need and have policies that reflect them. At the same time, they're nervous about, giving this information because then they don't want to be targeted or penalized for who they are. And so it's a really tight line to walk. But I always go to the fact that I think it's so much better to ask these questions than not. And trying to find ways in your own organizations or your own agencies, and working with partners that have been doing this for years, for decades, on how to best assure confidentiality and privacy and build that trust. And so that's really where I go to is ask the question, get these voices, lived experiences to build trust. But also be aware that there will be hesitancy. People may not want to answer just given the political environment, but because I think if not, it means it's even more important to ask these questions.
Yeah. It's a rough question.
It's a really good one. It's a good one. It's hard.
It is a really, really good question. And it'll be interesting to be part of the research community as we go through the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we've answered all the questions in the chat. We might have time for one more if you have a question, or if not, we're going to give you 5 minutes back on this Friday afternoon to maybe have a break before your next Zoom. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. And first things first is thank you so much, Aliya. This was really, really helpful. There's so much appreciation coming into the chat. Some of it's coming privately to me, so you won't get to see it, but there's lots of it. Second is there is no Talking Data Equity next Friday. Next Friday, I am on vacation. I will not be here. There is no Talking Data Equity. But the following Friday, July 29th, there will be Talking Data Equity, and we're having Sarah J, and I forget her last name, so I am very apologetic for that, but she is I don't know her pronouns, Sarah J. They are doing amazing work getting some public data biographies going out on the West Coast in the United States around health equity. And so publishing biographies about whose points of view got embedded in the various proprietary and public data sets that they're using to understand health equity. So if you have any ideas or questions about data biographies, 2 Fridays from now is the time to come. Next Friday, we are on vacation. No Talking Data Equity next Friday. 2 Fridays from now, same time, same place. And the last thing I'll say is that we are getting ready for our fall series of Talking Data Equity. And especially for folks who come a lot of Fridays, we would like to know who you'd like to hear from. So on our Talking Data Equity page, there's a form that you can put anybody's name and email in, including your own, if you would like to talk. So thank you, Aliya, for coming. This has been extraordinarily useful. These are some thorny questions that we talk about a lot. So it's really a fantastic opportunity to be able to connect with somebody with some actual lived experience around how to get this through policy, how to make some of these decisions. I know your time is really valuable, so thank you for spending an hour with us on a Friday.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. It was great chatting with you all and attempting to answer all these very important questions that we all have to grapple with. So, Heather has my information if anyone wants to reach out or has questions offline, and I'm also happy to send her the presentation if she wants to send it around for people to just dig through and read about things. So happy
to definitely send it to us, and we'll put it on the forum, and then everyone who wants it can have a look. Thank you so much. See y'all. Bye.